Hey everyone, and welcome to part one of our chapter 15 notes um, for Apush. And this chapter is entitled Secession and the Civil War. So at this point, I'll actually pause for a second and give you guys an opportunity here. You can pause the video if you want and get out your PowerPoint and also the detailed notes that I downloaded from the internet for you. You can get those out so you can follow along as we go through and discuss. And I'm just going to walk through the PowerPoint here and explain the different slides. If you end up having any questions, issues, anything I don't explain well enough, anything you need me to clarify on or give more explanation to, don't hesitate to throw a comment in classroom or email or whatever you need me to clarify for you. I'll obviously be more than happy to. So with that said, guys, this is chapter 15, Secession and Civil War. This is coming right after our Slavery Compromise unit that we just got done discussing, the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, and all those compromises that were attempting to hold the nation together. But at this point, it's become evident that the nation is not going to hold itself together. And also remember what happens the last thing we talked about in chapter 14 was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Remember, Lincoln carries almost entirely south. He doesn't win, entirely the north. He doesn't win any southern states at all. And so with Lincoln's election, alarm bells go off within the South. Lincoln is representing the Republican Party, which has been outspoken against slavery and a lot of the Southern institutions. With that, Lincoln himself has actually been pretty vocal on the issue of slavery, as you guys saw in that Lincoln-Douglas debate that you guys looked at last chapter. And remember, Lincoln himself is not actually saying that he wants to get rid of slavery everywhere. He's said that multiple times. His goal is really to stop the spread of slavery, and that is truly what he is looking to do. He's basically saying, look, if the South wants slavery, we'll let them have it, but ultimately he wants to keep it from going to the new territories, spreading into these new places. But that wasn't good enough for the South. They don't see that as enough common ground with Lincoln to actually trust that he is going to represent their issues and their views and their problems that they're concerned on. And so with Lincoln being elected and then also the feeling that the South felt they were ignored, the reality is that Lincoln will win the election without any Southern states voting for him. So it shows very clearly to the South that they were outnumbered, that their policies could not be pushed through because no matter what they did, they wouldn't garner enough political power to actually get those things through. So not only is this election a warning for them because of Lincoln and what he represented in terms of anti-slavery, this election also scares them because they're worried they're overpowered and they're going to be overshadowed. And I don't think they're wrong in that viewpoint. I think even if they had decided not to secede eventually, they would have lost a lot of the power or a lot of their policies because of the lack of representation. But anyway, with that said, we get the election of Lincoln, and now the South is going to take action. They're basically saying that we can't sit on our hands. We can't just decide to see what Lincoln is going to do. And so at this point, guys, if you want to go ahead and click for me, the South in this process of secession. Now, the first thing you need to understand is this is, number one, not the first time that the South has debated secession. If you think back to 1830s and Andrew Jackson and they had the Tariff of Abominations, South Carolina has threatened secession before. Now, Andrew Jackson answered it very definitively by basically saying he was going to cut his own vice president or hang his own vice president from the nearest tree if he tried to secede, which put down that particular rebellion. But in this case, it seems like the storm of secession is growing and that momentum is growing. Now, couple things here. There are various debates. This is kind of a political whirlwind that is going to happen during this time period. There are some Northerners that basically say, look, secession, war, we got to hold the country together. There are some Northerners that are actually going to say, you know what? Let the South have their own country. Boom, let them go. They're more of a headache than anything. We don't want to deal with slavery. We don't want to deal with all that stuff anymore. They can have it, or they can create their own country. And so it does not necessarily mean that secession automatically meant war. There were a number of people on both sides, both what will become the Confederates and the United States government, that want to try to find a compromise. They want to try to avoid war because war is costly in lives, it's costly in money, it's costly in time and power. And so ultimately, secession to some people did not necessarily mean war automatically. And there's still kind of this limbo time period where we're not entirely sure if we're going to go to civil war, even though these states are now essentially leaving the nation. There are several attempts that we'll talk about in a second to try to reconcile or try to fix this thing. Obviously, with the resulting civil war, they're not going to be very successful in that reconciliation. But there are some people that try to put the country back together. They're trying desperately to hold the country on the best that they can. There is debates yet again in the federal level of, number one, should we go to war to continue to hold the South there? Or also, they're going to debate the fact of legality. Does the federal government have the legal right to actually go to war against its own citizens? And that really becomes a big question mark of how much power is too much power. And is the federal government being tyrannical here? Are they trying to impose their views on a southern population that had their own way of life? And there is that debate that's going on as well of, is the federal government overstepping its bounds? And that's the reality, and that was a hot topic throughout. Anyway, at this point, next slide comes up here, and it should say across the top, the Deep South secedes. Now, remember, secession, guys, means to leave. Simplest definition there is. It literally means to leave the nation. And so they have this debate. There's this limbo period of, are they going to leave? Are they not going to leave? Can they legally? What can the government do about it? But by December 20th, Lincoln is basically set to take office 3 months from then. And at that point, South Carolina basically says, look, we can't wait around to see what Lincoln is going to do. What is going to be the legal response, all that mumbo jumbo. South Carolina basically says, we are done. We're over this. We're out. So December 20th, 1860, South Carolina officially becomes the first state to secede. They leave. Now, think of it like dominoes, though. South Carolina is the first domino. It falls over and knocks over a bunch. If you look on the list there, by February 1861, the Confederate States of America have now officially formed, and that includes South Carolina, which was the first nation to secede, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, notice the geography of who is seceding here. It is all the states that are the furthest south. So, let me ask you, why? Why do we see the Deep South as the ones to first secede? Answer is pretty simple. They had the most to lose. This is where slavery was deepest entrenched. You had your big cotton plantations. You have the big cotton industry that's built on the institution of slavery. And their economics were wholeheartedly dependent upon this system. They were also culturally the most different than the people in the North. And so you had that cultural divide that we talked about last chapter that was going on, is going to be most felt in these regions. So, almost immediately, the Deep South says we are out because of those reasons. All right, they are done. They are over it, and they fully secede. And they actually, yet again, go as far as forming the Confederate States of America. They even draw up their own constitution, which you guys will check out in a couple of days. As we'll talk about moving forward, they'll elect a president. They'll, so on and so forth. They actually named Richmond their capital, and so they're fairly organized and they are ready to go. But yet again, geographically, it is going to be the Deep South that makes that first jump. If we go to the next slide, I believe it is. Yes, it is. It's a map. Now, this is what I wanted to show you geographically, though. The green is that Deep South. They're the ones that, boom, are instantly done. They're over it, and they leave the country. There was no debate. They didn't have any issues about it. Boom, they're gone. The states that you see there in kind of the yellowy color, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, they are going to have a much tougher time. Now, these are slave states. So ultimately, they had the institution of slavery. They relied on it, but not as heavily as the states that are in green. For them, though, the question of leaving the Union is a much tougher one. Many of the people, especially in Virginia, had business interests in the North. They had relationships with the North, and these border states, if you will, are kind of a little bit more reluctant to leave. Overall, though, these four states will consider themselves Southern, I guess, or have more ties culturally to the states below them. And so they will end up seceding. They all just end up seceding by a later date. The Deep South secedes by 1860. The states you see in yellow don't really succeed until like 1861. So it is a progression. Now, the interesting states in this whole equation, though, are going to be the ones we see in red, or they're kind of the pinkish color, if you will. They were slave states: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. But they will actually decide to not leave the Union. So they will stay with the North, even though they had slavery, which is an interesting situation because they will fight against a lot of the ideals that they had. But for a lot of the people living, I don't know if it was because slavery wasn't as entrenched, or maybe the people culturally were more close to the people in the North. I'm not exactly sure 100% what that would be. I don't know if anybody really is. But a lot of those states will eventually vote and make the choice to stay with the Union. Interesting case especially is going to be West Virginia. West Virginia obviously was part of Virginia. When Virginia decides to secede and leave the nation, West Virginia, or the citizens of West Virginia, will actually vote to separate and create their own state in order to avoid that separation. They will actually officially become a state in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. And so that's kind of where we get West Virginia from. It used to be all of Virginia, but the question of secession was really what split those places off. And so, obviously, the purple states up top are the free states. If you notice, the West Coast, California, and Oregon are also going to be part of the North and stay with the Union. So they will fight alongside soldiers from the other states in purple and orange. The light blue territories, it really depended on the citizens there. The territories themselves did not necessarily choose a side, although most of them will side with the North. But I'm sure some people in Mexico territory and so on and so forth will probably fight alongside Texas. But either way, that is the breakdown of secession and kind of the progression. Remember, Deep South secedes first, almost instantly. But those border states, if you will, had a question to decide. Okay, some of the border states will stay with the North, some of the border states will stay with the South, and a lot of that had to do with culture and the decisions each state made. All right, let's go to our last slide for today. So it continues with the Deep South secedes. Essentially, when you take a look, guys, at the Constitution of the Confederate United States, you'll see it later in the week. It resembles the Constitution of the United States. Very clearly, it's going to be very similar. Guys were obviously very heavily influenced by the democracy that the United States had, and they wanted to continue that system of government. Obviously, though, they left the institution of slavery in and that kind of stuff like that. The idea is to try to restore pre-Republican Party union. They want to bring back basically the Democrats and the Whigs. They want to go back to the way it was. They like the United States the way it was before, and they don't want it to change. They also want more political power, and that's a big driving force for the separation that they're attempting to do through secession. There is actually a hope among many Southerners that there are going to be this wave of revolution, that these other northern states will come to the realization that this federal government is tyrannical,